right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an IPR Edelman co-hosted webinar on the 2026 Edelman Trust Barometer. We look forward to having um, our panelists give their perspectives from their respective industries on the findings. For Margot Edelman here to share the findings with us, and Nicole Schumann from PR News to help facilitate the discussion. Before we get started, I just have a few notes. We will be recording this and it is available on our website and YouTube channel within 48 hours. If you have any questions, we will have some time for an audience Q&A at the very end. So please submit all questions in the Q&A function. And then if you do have any tech issues, just private message me and I'll help sort those out. And now I'm going to hand it over to Margot and do the very easy process of sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brittany. And of course, thank you to the IPR team for having myself and of course our esteemed panelists on to talk about the 2026 Trust Barometer. I think this is the third or fourth year we're doing this together. And of course, the data is as compelling as ever this year. So I'm going to walk you through it quickly. There's a lot here, but I want to make sure we also get time for a discussion since we have a great group of panelists here with us who really represent sort of the different facets of the different institutions we're surveying: media, government, business, NGOs. So with that, let's just get right into the presentation. So if you want to go to the next slide, Brittany. So this is the 26th year we're doing the Trust Barometer. It's an annual survey. It's in 28 countries, about 1,200 respondents per country. So it's really a statistically significant sample size. And we really did it sort of a representative sample of countries in the developed world and developing world. Next slide. Just want to give you a little bit of an overview of sort of 26 years of trust. Some interesting stats on here. In 2005, we see trust shift from authorities to peers. 2016, the mass class divide. And then more recently in 2023, navigating a polarized world. Last year, a crisis of grievance. And then this year, we're calling it trust amid insularity. What does that mean? What we see is it goes from polarization, the belief that our country is divided, to grievance. There's a resentment towards a system that's rigged against you, to insularity, a reluctance to trust anybody who's different from you. And interestingly, this year, and again, it mimics 2025, is that we see that trust is growing in developing countries, but has stagnated in the developed world. So if you look at where there is trust, it's places like the UAE, India, Saudi. Where is there not trust? It's in places like Japan, UK, Germany, Korea, the US. So again, we really sort of see a schism between the developed and developing world on trust in institutions. And what we also see is there's geopolitical insularity. My country's companies are trusted more than foreign countries. My domestic trust advantage, my country versus foreign, that is particularly high for Canada, Germany, Japan, the UK, the US. It's only 44% of people in the US trust companies headquartered in foreign countries. That's only 29% in Japan. So big gaps there. We also see that the income divide has more than doubled since 2012. And what do I mean by the income divide? It means that those who are high income trust, they think the world is working for them, things are going well, they trust institutions. And then low income, that bottom 25%, there's a 15-point gap, whereas there was only a 6-point gap in 2012. So pretty significant change. And what we talk about is high and low income really live in opposing institutional realities. So what do we mean by that? It means that those who are high income believe that business is both competent and ethical, but they also somewhat trust NGOs, somewhat media, maybe not as much government, but that is completely slid down for those who are low income. And you can see that those who are low income both think government is not competent and not ethical. So some pretty interesting stats on there. And as fears rise, trust is going local. So what do we mean by that? Only a few believe that the next generation will be better off than they are today, 5 years from now. And that's a 4-point change from 2025 to 2026. And these numbers are shockingly low in some countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, et cetera. Really low numbers there, and it's just going backwards. Also, trade and recession-related job fears have hit an all-time high. People worry about tariff conflict. That's definitely gone up from 2019 to 2026. I wonder why. And they're also worried about losing their job as a result of a looming recession. And again, that's gone up 6 points from 2020 to 2026. The majority of those who are low income feel fear being left behind by AI. And what's interesting here too is even in the US, the majority actually of those who are high income actually even fear that they're going to be left behind by AI. So it's not just those who are low income, it's everybody, in particular in the US. There's also fears that foreign actors will spread disinformation, and they worry that this will sow domestic division. This is reaching all-time highs. I worry other countries purposefully contaminate our media with falsehoods to inflame our differences. And that's up 11 points in the last 5 years. There's also been a turn inwards. There's a widespread decline in exposure to differing political views. We asked people, do you get information from sources with a different political leaning than yours at least weekly? Only 39% of people said they did, and this is a 6-point change from 2025 to 2026, so pretty significant. And then we also see folks going from we to me. What does that mean? It means that we're losing our shared institutions and that my local circle is winning. And people say that as a result of a major societal event in the last 5 years, they've lost trust in government leaders, major news organizations, foreign business leaders. Who have they gained trust in? My neighbors, family and friends, my coworkers, my CEO. Insularity stops progress. What do we mean? Worldwide, 7 in 10 have an insular mindset. What do we mean by insular? It means when it comes to trusting somebody who lives by different core values, believes in different facts, and trusts different sources, wants to address societal problems differently than I do, has a different culture, background, or lifestyle, I'm generally unwilling or hesitant to trust them. Unmitigated differences also stall economic growth. People actually believe they'd rather switch departments than report to a manager with different values than them. That's pretty extreme. It's also a loss of productivity. 34% say if their project team leader had a different political belief than them, they'd put less effort into helping them succeed. And 34% say they'd actually reduce the number of foreign companies operating in my country, even if it meant higher prices. Again, pretty extreme. With an insular trust mindset, my circle is trusted and institutional leaders are not. So that means my CEO is trusted, my neighbors are trusted, but CEOs, journalists, Rachel will be interested in hearing your perspective on this, and government leaders fall into the distrust category. And with an insular trust mindset, grievance is more likely. When people have a moderate or higher sense of grievance, a lot of times they'll have an insular mindset. When they have an open mindset, there's far less grievance. So again, these two are correlated. With an insular trust mindset, institutions with leaders different than me are distrusted. So when people have an open mindset, they actually are willing to trust business, NGOs, government, media. But we see significant gaps. So those with insular mindsets are not. And there is, on the positive side, there's a global consensus that insularity needs to be addressed. So we asked people, are people in my country distrust those differences so much that they actively try to make things worse for one another? Is this a moderate problem or is this a larger crisis level problem? 76% of people across the world say it is. So trust brokering. the response to insularity. What does it mean? We think that trust brokering is a set of practices and behaviors that counters insularity by facilitating trust across difference. How? Rather than trying to change people, trust brokering surfaces the common interests of insulated parties and translates their goals for one another. And who can do this? It's a person, an organization, an institution. And again, Ben, be very interested in hearing your thoughts on this. At the CFR, how do we act? How do the different organizations we all belong to act as trust brokers? So trust brokering belongs with acknowledgement and acceptance of differences. So we asked people, why do you trust somebody different from me in their values, sources, approaches to societal problems, or their background? It's openness. They have an open mind and they don't try to change me. They're transparent in how they're different from me. And then positive experiences. They've helped me in the past. They've defended me when I've been criticized. And trust brokering is the most powerful action for business to earn trust in high-stakes moments. Business could earn my trust by encouraging people to cooperate in finding solutions without taking a side, supporting the position that's true to its values, supporting my position, not taking any public position on the issue. So it's really about encouraging people to cooperate. And international trust brokering, it hinges on long-term local relationships. If a company from a country that I distrust wanted to operate in my local community, this is really interesting, it could earn my trust by investing in the long-term community projects, hiring people from my community, or short-term helping my community recover from a crisis, or donating to my company's social organizations. And it really is these first two, hiring and long-term community projects, that help to build trust in foreign companies. And there's a mandate for all institutions to broker trust, and we think employers are best positioned. So what do we mean by that? It means, do you mind going back? It means there's a gap on expectation versus performance, but this is where the gap is the smallest. So there's an obligation for the institution to do it. So for business, it stands at 73 points, whereas only 47% feel that it's doing it well. For NGOs, sort of similar numbers. And so we found that my employer is actually the one where the gap is the most narrow, that people feel the institution is doing well on trust brokering. So again, there's a real opportunity to start with your business, your company, in doing this. So what's the playbook for it? So NGOs, government, and media, fulfill your role in brokering trust. So we asked, is this an effective strategy for this institution to facilitate trust between distrusting groups? For NGOs, it's about translating between the groups. Help distrusting groups understand each other, establish local community mediation programs. For government, set the right tone. Avoid rhetoric that blames or vilifies particular groups. Require politicians to engage in civic discourse. And for media, de-escalate tensions. Dedicate equal time and coverage to different viewpoints on big issues. Write accurate headlines instead of exaggerated or fear-inducing ones. So be very interested in what this group thinks about the information on this slide when we get into discussion. And for business, showcase your best practices for trust brokering. So it's about bringing employees into the workplace to interact with people who are different than them. And it's about partnering with unexpected organizations to initiate cross-cultural or cross-political conversations. And Laura, I know you and I have talked about this, a bunch. And reskilling seems like an area that, in particular, business and in particular the tech community can really own in this sort of age of AI. And for employers, what do we mean? What are effective strategies? It's promoting a shared identity and culture so that employees are reminded of what unites them rather than what divides them. It's building teams that will require people with different values to work together to succeed. And it's actually providing mandatory employee training for how to engage in constructive dialogue among conflict. And CEOs are expected to lead by example. So when it comes to bridging divides and facilitating trust, we actually see there's a 29-point gap in CEOs between what people feel their obligation is, and versus what they're doing well. So CEOs clearly have an issue here as well. And what are effective strategies? It's ensuring that CEOs consult people with different values and backgrounds when making business decisions, and having CEOs constructively engage with groups who criticize or distrust the company. And on social media, leverage established relationships to boost trust. So we asked, I would trust a financial influencer if they endorsed a financial services company I distrusted. 57% say they would still trust this person. Only 15% say they would lose trust in this person. Similar numbers for a food and lifestyle influencer. So influencers actually can play a big role here. And successful trust brokering can actually help close the income-based trust gap. So when when institutions broker trust well, low income become much more trusting overall, in addition to those who are high income. So to conclude, brokering trust in the age of insularity. First, pervasive insularity clearly stalls progress. We can see there's currently an insular trust mindset that prevails globally. 7 in 10 are unwilling or hesitant to trust somebody different than them. And so, of course, perfect alignment is not going to happen. Business really should address insularity. If it's left addressed, unmitigated differences are going to stall workplace productivity, undermine leadership, and harden resistance to innovation. Just remember the stat of, a number of people saying they'd rather switch teams than work for somebody with different viewpoints than them. It's pretty extreme. So to counter, in particular, geopolitical insularity, it's about evolving to a polynational model, really focused on being local and centering on the local community. Trust brokering is a strategy and skill set. It can be executed by institutions and individuals with different requirements, again, based on what kind of institution you belong to. But importantly, it's about listening without judgment and translating realities. These are 2 key skill sets we see in trust brokering. And lastly, employers are well positioned for this. They have the smallest expectation to performance gap, and this makes them well positioned to scale trust brokering across the board. And this is something where it can be bringing together people who come from different backgrounds, have different opinions, different political views, and encouraging them to work together. And we don't need to go through this. No one on the line needs to see the supplemental data index. So
thanks, Margot, for walking us through the report. I know as someone who works in the media and someone who reports on PR, there's a lot of juxtapositions here. So it was interesting to see those results. And there's a lot of information here. And a lot that has to do with CEOs. So I'm wondering, especially for those watching, if you're briefing a CEO on this year's report in 5 minutes, what is probably the one insight you would tell them that they cannot ignore?
That is a great question. I think that retreat into insularity, I think, is incredibly important to note, and that it almost like keeps getting more and more extreme every year. And that there are sort of specific things that sort of those of us, those in business, those sort of on the media side, government, et cetera, can do to pull back from insularity. And in particular, I thought the part about sort of companies needing to sort of focus on being polynational versus, multinational, I thought was a very tangible thing to do to sort of break down geopolitical barriers. I also think the idea of sort of finding common ground, in particular, finding ground between, your employees, I thought was also something that was, very, very interesting and valuable as well. But I do think sort of that retreat into insularity, if it's not checked, I think to me was the biggest takeaway.
Yeah, that makes me think about the McDonald's CEO from last week, trying to do the burger bite. But it's also spun off a ton of memes where, can my CEO do this job, or could my CEO apply for a job on LinkedIn, or things like that. So kind of CEOs needing to see a common ground, I think. So that's pretty interesting. Now I'm going to open up the. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, Totally agree. And I think another sort of fact in there that stood out to me was sort of that insularity of information. So the fact that so few people read, sources and get information from, publications or even social media that have different viewpoints than theirs, I also thought was a really interesting stat. So people are actively working just to reinforce their own insularity versus sort of finding ways to go outside of it and seek information from people with other opinions. So to me, that was just another fascinating stat that sort of shows the state of the world and the state of where sort of people's beliefs are right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're going to open up the questions now to the panel that we have. First off, the barometer suggests that insularity, we talked a little bit about that, is, a growing reluctance to trust those outside one's own organization or relationships. And that might now be a defining force in global trust dynamics. So for you guys, from where you sit, does that resonate? And how is that shaping the way you approach your own communications leadership? Whoever wants to go first, you guys go for it.
Nicole, I don't mind jumping in if that's all right with the group.
Great.
And I'd just start first by thanking you for moderating IPR, for hosting Margot and Edelman, for sharing what I find is every year a really compelling set of data and insights. Look, speaking personally, the terrain just mapped resonates with me. We see it in media, we see it in our communities. Some of us likely see it in our families and around the dining room table. What I want to say, at the risk of sounding a little trite, is that there's also opportunity here. And Margaret, that's one of my takeaways from what you've laid out. And when it comes to communications, it's a reminder, at least for me, to start at our core. Right? We always talk about the best way to be physically in shape is start with your core. And for an institution like the Council on Foreign Relations, it's been around for over 100 years, it's got to be mission centric. So the Council's mission for over 100 years has been to inform U.S. engagement in the world. And how we go about doing that is important to invoke, to remind ourselves, and to execute on week by week. So yes, this resonates with me, but I also hope that as a communicator, there's some opportunity. And as we go through the conversation, one of the phrases that stuck out for me, Margot, was that trust goes local. And for an organization that is globally oriented, what does that mean for us? And I think it's a space that we are actively exploring right now to make sure we can fulfill that mission I described of informing U.S. engagement in the world.
I'm happy to dive in as well. And I think a lot of what Ben mentioned, I really agree with, and that we see this both as communicators. I think probably everyone on this call sees this in some way as communicators, but also just as a person who lives in the world, that this kind of insularity and the fragmentation and the way in which audiences and that all of us are seeing trust and getting information, of course, is shifting so much. And it inherently needs to shape the way we approach both comms, but also as individuals when we're trying to make a point, how we actually reach people, how we are consuming information. And it's something I think about a lot. As head of comms at Semaphore, which is a global news organization, is something we think about a lot as well. And I don't think there's a clear, clean-cut answer to it, but I do think that something guiding me and that really stands out is something that Ben mentioned as well, which is just that there's an opportunity that comes with this challenge of insularity, which is just the interesting and harder question of how you create moments of actual connectivity across groups and how to find moments and inroads that create those moments. So I think that's a lot of the framing and overall shape of how we're thinking about it and how I think about it in my life and as a communicator.
And I'll jump in on that too, because I think at Pearson, we think a lot about trust, just in general, because of what we do. We're a 180-year-old learning and education company, right? We're a UK listed company with 70% of our business in the US. And so we have to think globally, but we also have to think locally as well. And I think that the thing that resonates with the trust barometer for me really happens on two levels. And that's that external level where as communicators, I think our job gets a little harder almost every year and every iteration we see this kind of data because people are starting now from a place of skepticism more so than ever before, right? So I think the hill to climb to build trust is even taller and higher than it was before. And then I think about it internally, right? As a leader internally, as someone who's responsible for communicating to a large company full of people, it also really makes me reflect on what people are bringing to work with them, right? And oftentimes the heaviness that people are bringing to the company, to the office, to the team every single day with what they're experiencing in the outside world and how that's affecting them. So I think I really tend to think about this and look at this as how do we think about this as communication professionals, but also how do we think about this as leaders who are working with people who are, Rachel, to your point, living in this world every day and experiencing as human beings.
And maybe just to round it out, I mean, I agree with a lot of the sentiments there. I think, Margo, when you pulled up the slide around economic disparity and cost of living being two of the major drivers for insularity, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I represent Encore. We're a financial services company. We operate globally in 8 different countries. We have 8,000 employees across the globe. So I agree with you, Laura. There's an internal and external piece of this. There's no question. I also think, the burden is maybe we were articulating a little bit in different words is a lot higher for companies to get this right. I think the companies that do are going to exponentially become the winners in this category. The ones who aren't focused on this, they're going to fall very behind and very quickly. I think the old model of persuasion to the masses is done. We have to be willing to engage, not just inform. And so I think if you can illustrate that you understand where people are today, but not just emotionally and psychologically, but also, as we said, locally and culturally, I think you'll get that puzzle correct. So I think we're focused on that quite a lot. And I also think it means informing your leaders to fill that vacuum very quickly. Because every single day, as we've already articulated, the employees that show up, they're looking for their managers and their leaders. And I know we've talked a lot about CEOs, but they're really looking at their leader to say, hey, do you understand where I am? They want someone in their corner and not someone just physically in their corner, but mentally, do they understand the realities that they're dealing with? So completely resonates with me.
Great, thanks everyone. And I think I'll start with Faryar, since you're talking about, the study itself talks a lot about the income-based trust gap. We are seeing a lot of that right now, particularly in the United States. There's inflation, there's market volatility, there is, interest rate issues and home buying issues and all of that kind of stuff. So, it's particularly pronounced in financial systems with what you deal with. So I'm curious from your point of view, how is that shaping the way that financial institutions are approaching transparency and stakeholder engagement? I mean, it's a volatile time for so much of finance. So curious to what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think every year I look forward to this study for a variety of reasons, but one of the slides I know that's in the appendix is the look at how the industries fare on trust, right? And financial services tends to be at the very bottom almost every single time. And I think a lot of that is, yes, market-driven, environmental. I think people have obviously a lot of concerns with their financial situations. But I also think a lot of that is self-inflicted on the industry, by the industry. And what I mean by that is if you look across all the industries that at least are captured in this report, many of them are highly regulated. The one thing I've always said about highly regulated industries is they're very misunderstood. And a lot of that is they just haven't told their story. And I think a more understandable and cohesive, and I guess in the context of this year's study, in a more localized way, right? And so that's one of the things that I think really matters quite a lot. I think the other piece of this is we're talking a lot about trust, but I think a lot of people can probably appreciate and agree with this, that one of the missing or maybe most special ingredients to building trust is empathy. I think financial institutions have a massive responsibility to, I think, articulate that they are flexible, that they understand where people are today, what type of tools and platforms they might need to make their lives easier. And I think because it's so technical and so abstract, and you talked a lot about different sort of financial mechanisms, rates, can I afford my house? Can I afford my car? Can I just afford to put food on the table? These are real concerns. And I think if financial institutions continue to talk about what they do for the consumer in a very technical way, they're going to continue to lose out on sort of that relationship and that trust. So I think that's something that's really important, making sure we flatten the language, making sure we make our brands more humanized. And I think the other piece I'll just leave with everybody is, I think we can appreciate this as humans. Math and emotion don't typically play nicely together, right? I think you want to do the right thing, but sometimes the math doesn't add up. And so I think for financial services companies, it's injecting more human emotion into the messaging. At least that's what we're focused on quite a lot. And if you look at our business, a lot of it is dealing with consumers who are either in debt or working their way to achieve financial freedom. And so that's really, really, it's not unique to us right now in this economic environment. We're always dealing with it. So we definitely appreciate the disparity more than anything. I'll also say, I thought it was interesting. Businesses, I think, are seen as more competent and ethical, regardless of where you sit on the income spectrum, than NGOs. And I think that's fascinating. Typically, financial services companies are doing a lot in the community through NGOs to build their reputation. But if you think about it now, where people are actually seeing as the business more competent and ethical in building trust, I think that's a whole new paradigm shift that we have to really attack. So there's quite a lot going on, Nicole.
Great. And that brings me to, I was going to head over to Ben in relation to NGOs. There's also income-based trust gap for NGOs. Issues there. So how are NGOs that you guys are working with, or what you've seen, how are they thinking about communicating with stakeholders who, we talk a lot about local, they may feel disconnected from more elite or global institutions, or maybe even financial institutions?
Gosh, a big question to try to take a bite out of. And again, I'll just speak from the sort of narrow corner of that world that I occupy, and that is the council. Look, we're a legacy institution. Laura, you invoked the history of Pearson. We also over 100 years old. Don't be fooled by the Park Avenue location of our headquarters. The question of how we bridge divides and perception gaps is front and center, at least for me, day to day. And I go back to some of those core approaches that I think this community of communicators on screen and in the audience will understand and are adept at. And on that note, I want to give a shout out to Pat Ford, who plopped into the chat a minute ago, and hopefully I reflect at least a few of the things I learned from Pat. So for any of us, a new institution or old one, we have to, what I call show and tell. We have a certain set of guiding principles and values at the council, one of which is nonpartisanship, another of which is independence, all at the aim of cultivating conversations around the U.S. role in the world. We need to be able to state our values and our principles that have guided us clearly over and over again, and then model that behavior. And one of the things that is so central to our approach to addressing these issues of the day is convening conversations. And we are engaging this administration, as we have every administration over the course of our history. We are endeavoring to reflect diversity of views in every facet of our institution. So that's the programming on stage, that is the network of state and local officials that we develop across the country. That is our membership, which is such a core part of this institution, our governance structure, and our scholarship. So that's either the fellows we have in our think tank arm or in the articles in Foreign Affairs magazine. Can we model that behavior of a diversity of views and a rigorous debate that allows, whether it's our membership as part of our stakeholder community or a broader public, to make its own decisions about the direction the country's taking as it engages with the world? So that's just so fundamental, Nicole, and I hope I haven't strayed too much from your question. The last thing I would add on this note is, we have sensed, and I think other institutions have as well, there is still a thirst for expertise. That at the end of the day, if you present a point of view that is well-informed and viewed as authentic, that we still see the traffic for that. And we're lucky that we have scholars that can demonstrate that expertise. We just need to make sure we're using new channels, doubling down on traditional channels. And to go a nod back to something that Margot presented, look at how we can convey this expertise at a more and more local level. If indeed our role is to inform the U.S. role in the world, how are we getting that message outside of DC and New York and across the rest of the country?
Ben, I had a quick follow-up for that. Just thinking about current events. Does the advent of wartime, does that, change your strategy at all?
I think in moments like we've experienced the past week, it compels us to double down on a good chunk of what I said. Counterparts, colleagues who on our digital side are continuing to experiment with new and different channels from social media to other digital tools to get the word out on the media side, which I oversee, among other things. It's making sure that we try to inform the conversation in real time as best we can. And we're still learning as we go, but we have to be nimble. And there's an element, whether it's Nicole to this question or other parts of the conversation, where engagement is not just telling more and more; it's also listening. I know it's a phrase that we throw around as communicators. Fire, Laura, I think there's elements of what you described in internal engagement around that, but in the engagement, it's listening to what the questions are before just giving an answer, and that can apply to major pivotal geopolitical events in terms of what people want to know, and also then meeting people where they are. And again, that goes to this element that I'm interested in mining further after this conversation of trust going local. And again, I think that speaks to meeting people where they are and getting out of certain bubbles that we have.
No, that's great. Thank you for that. And Margot, I know we are talking about media trust and those sorts of things. I'm curious if Edelman, if they include local media in that, or if that's something that might be explored in the future. As I know, local media.
That's a great question. I think it would be really interesting to dig into types of media, whether it's sort of influencers, local media. We have not done that this year, but I have to imagine, given that focus on local, that looking at local media would absolutely change the numbers you see.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Totally agree.
Speaking of media, Rachel, hot topic for a lot of people right now. The media, it continues to play a central role in shaping public trust. It's how people get information, whether it's through a newsletter, whether it's actually watching on TV, whether it's, reading, something online or in a physical paper, it's still important. But the barometer reflects a significant gap in the ability it has to bridge divides, possibly because media has just become so splintered. What structural realities make that role especially challenging today? You're working for a news organization, so I feel like you'd have a good stand on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say there were a couple things that kind of stood out to me during that presentation, specifically on the barometer that really touched on some of the components that I can speak to. At Semaphore, I work for a global news company that is new and started 3 years ago and was very much designed and was launched in part to try to address the challenge of trust in news and trust in media. And so I think looking at this from the perspective of a few structural dynamics that put pressure on the media as an industry, the barometer said, I wrote down in my notes that 81% of respondents say they want media to dedicate equal time and coverage to different viewpoints. The same number want accurate headlines instead of fear-inducing ones or exaggerated ones. And I think if you zoom out at kind of what the incentive structures of the last decade have been for media as an industry, it's often pushed almost in the opposite direction, where there is a real drive for clicks, which means there's a drive for what will make you most interested to click on it, which tends to be exactly that kind of exaggerated headline. And similarly, the same kind of insularity drive means that you're less like media often has a different kind of incentive structure for that. And the digital component of those incentive shifts has meant leaning in more to the conflict and polarization rather than clarity. And that's really something we've seen across newsrooms, and it's of course compounded the trust. And so I can say at Semaphore, our founders really tried to build the idea of trust and transparency as a design principle. Like, how do we structure this in a very, very deliberate way? And so all of our articles are structured by having
we call it a semaphore, which essentially separates out the news from analysis and says like very explicitly, here's the reporter who's writing this view. So this is, if I was writing this, I'd say like, here's my view on this news story, rather than embedding it into a story which is the traditional format that most news organizations have followed, where we kind of anonymize and strip out. If you're reading a story across most outlets for most of our time across legacy media, you see a story, but it rarely says like, this is what this individual who wrote it thinks. And here's another person, what another person thinks. And we at Semaphore really have leaned in instead to the fact that people are people, and the people who are writing this will have views. And we trust our audiences to want to understand and can, rather than trying to suss out what the views are that are embedded in here, to be really explicit and separating out so that readers always know what they're getting, where it's coming from. And I think the thinking about our incentive structure, especially for new media organizations that are starting, and building it around that idea of what trust is and the idea of where we can kind of bridge these divides, to your question, allows really new models to have to take shape, because the existing structures with the kind of drive to clicks, the drive to kind of what these incentives tend to be from a business perspective, have tended to kind of go against directly those what viewers and what audiences and what readers and the really want to see.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like readers say, or people answering the barometer, they say they want one thing, but then the actions show another. So it's but I really like the point you make about the transparency of the reporters. I think transparency is obviously one of the top items that communicators are looking for right now, that people are looking for right now when it comes to trust. So I'm eager to read some more Semaphore articles to kind of see how that works. That's pretty cool. I know we've kind of been talking a lot about distrust, so maybe we'll move over to trust. Laura, lucky you. Teachers and academic experts are still among the most trusted voices globally, so that's good. But education, has been under fire a lot this year. How can educational institutions protect and extend that trust from those teachers and academics in a more polarized environment where this is happening?
Yeah, and I would say that I think the polarization in education is sort of one issue. I actually happen to think that the bigger issue facing just trust in education generally right now is the fact that what we like to call this sort of learning to earning model is really failing a lot of people, right? So there's been this sort of social compact, I think, where you go to school and you start young and we put you through an education pipeline and you come out at the end and there's going to be a job for you, right? And I think, yes, there's polarization that exists, and that I think is sort of the really kind of hot thing for people to want to talk about. But I think when this sort of break in this social compact and this education model that just doesn't work for a lot of people anymore is the thing that is really sort of eroding trust when you think about education. And I think there's a lot of ways that you have to go at sort of solving that, because there are solves for that. Some of it does involve bringing educators into the mix and leaning on those people who are very trusted and supporting those people. But I think even bigger than that, it's figuring out, how do you look at the education system and the education model that we have now and start to think about, how does the pathway for people get very diverse, right? Because we've got 30 million people without a high school diploma, 40 million people in the US with some college but no degree, right? And you start to look at, I checked this morning, and it's like almost 5.5% unemployment for recent college grads. So how do you start to rebuild that kind of trust? And how do you start to look at, where do educators play in that, and the role that we have with bringing educators in to help us solve these problems? Because to your point, one of the things Trust Barometer does tell us is scientists and educators are among the most trusted people, right? So I think those are the people in society that we have to support the most. And especially when you start thinking about teachers, it's one of the things as a company we really have been looking at is how do you support the educators who have to now prepare people for a workforce in an era of AI that is rapidly changing and completely difficult. So, and different than I think what a lot of us came into when we began to enter the workforce. So I think that that concentration on educators, how do we support them and how do we enable them to do what they do best? Because there's a lot of concern out there around, is technology going to replace teachers and educators? And it's not, and it shouldn't, right? So really being able to support, I think, teachers as a community so they can then support learners and help kind of restore this education compact to what I think people expect it to be and to where it's a trusted place again.
Yeah, and looking at the part about optimism about the next generation's future remaining low in the data, I think education probably is an important part to turn that around. How does, an education organization balance the realism of this about economic pressures, with a forward-looking narrative? Like how can you guys overcome that?
Yeah, I think the first part really is about being real and acknowledging, like, really just what I talked about, that the model that's out there isn't perfect and is broken for a lot of people. So how do you start to fix that model, right? And I think what you have to do is come to the table with solutions, but also come to the table with real outcomes, right? And so that to me is the fix, is looking at how do we start to completely reshape and reimagine what an education system begins to look like in an era where you're going to have to work hand in hand with technology and where you're going to have to learn throughout your life, right? Because there is no like leaving education anymore, right? You now have to learn throughout your career. You have to, be able to reskill, retrain. And I think being able to enable people to do that and do that easily and more accessibly is a big part of being able to rebuild trust and also give people some hope for the future, right? And I think there's a lot of talk right now about sort of the AI jobs apocalypse, right? That we hear about, and millions and millions of jobs are going to go away with AI, and I think that's driving a lot of distrust and mistrust. And personally, I don't think we have to accept that, right? There are a lot of things that we can do as leaders, as workers, as people in the education industry, to be able to skill people to be able to work alongside technology and master the technology so it doesn't master us. So I think there's a lot of very tangible things we can do to keep that trust and also keep that hope alive for the generation of workers that's starting and students that are coming into a workforce that's very much different than what a lot of us have entered into years ago.
That's great. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to take some of those from the audience. We've been talking a lot about employees and how that relates to trust. I think that can work for all of your industries. Great question from Lynn Wheel. With employees increasingly hesitant to work with those who hold different personal values, how can an organization foster a functional culture without enforcing an ideological monoculture? Whoever wants to take that, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't know if this is the most satisfactory answer, but when I saw that question, I jotted down a couple of things, and I think there are a few other questions that are similar. I think despite the fact that we're talking about a lot of changes, and I think the requirements of communications, I still think some of the principles around authenticity, transparency, consistency, those haven't gone away. If anything, those are more important than ever. And so how that relates to employees, I think companies have to be really authentic in who they are. That's always been true. But I think it's more important now. If that doesn't align with an employee's values, then maybe that's not the right place for them to be. But what I would say is a company should be very clear about what their values are. And I think we need to find common ground amongst employees. For large corporations of, honestly, any company of any size, you're not going to find human beings that agree on everything. But the truth is, they're probably there at that organization because they believe in the mission and mandate of that organization. And so leaning into that, I think, can always be a good outcome. I think injecting things that are not that maybe are at odds with the mission and vision and values of any organization, that's when you start to get into trouble. But also making sure that the leaders understand that, right? And so I think employees, there's no I know technically there are some contracts, but philosophically there aren't contracts that say you can't leave. Anyone can leave if the company doesn't align with what they agree with. And so I think leaning into commonalities is always a good thing and being very authentic. So again, probably not the most satisfactory answer, but just something that came to mind as I saw some of those questions.
I would just double stomp that response and the authenticity point and being clear about values. I'm taking notes from what you said.
I agree, and I think the authenticity point also gets into like a broader media question around trust and structural issues and the rise of creators, the rise of influencers as well, is that there's a real strive to be so transparent and authentic that we really care about what individuals think. And so for comms leaders talking to CEOs, to organizational leaders, the idea of really making sure that an organization leader can lay out their thinking to an organization that they're leading and be transparent about where maybe they're falling short or where they're struggling. I think that that tends to be well regarded, both on a wide scale for communicating, but also in these kind of interpersonal dynamics that we're talking about here when it comes to employees. And I think that can be scaled when we're thinking about how we communicate about tackling tough challenges. There's a certain degree of trust that audiences, whether it be depending on whether you're talking about your organization or broadly, can understand that there are really tough challenges sometimes, and sometimes being able to be very transparent about the difficulties that you're having and addressing it, about what you're thinking about, what went into those decisions. I think that's a different kind of approach that sometimes a traditional comms PR speak might be, of coming in fully buttoned up, but I think it can often really lead to more trust and understanding from the audiences you're talking to.
I guess one more thing, just based sort of in the data that I thought was interesting, was sort of the stat around listening and then being open. I think those two things, again, sort of going to Rachel's point around how it can be a little bit different from sort of that, totally buttoned up. We totally have the playbook. But I think those two things of sort of coming in with openness and sort of showing a willingness to listen are also important.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about employees who, might have been with a company for a while, and we can tell employees when you're applying somewhere to, look into the company, look into their mission, all that sorts of things. But sometimes leadership changes its way. You look at Elon Musk and, Tesla this past couple of years. Look at, look at Amazon. Then the Post and some different things going on. So people might have signed up for one thing and then not gotten what they wanted, a couple of years later. So I think that's something for leaders to be be wary of. And leadership can always change. So that means a lot as well. Thinking about that. Let's see, we do have 5 more minutes, so we'll do a couple more questions if we can fit those in. This is a good one for everybody. This is from Alex McLaughlin. Pew and YBRSS data, I don't know what YBRSS is, suggests that young people have a growing trust in AI and social media sources of information, including health information, and a decreasing trust in people such as therapists, counselors, and even parents. Any comments on how to address this sort of distrust? And we've got about 4 minutes, so anyone that wants to take that on. Thinking of health influencers and thinking of doctors. Are there, Laura, or are there any sort of educational influencers out there? And how does that relate to education and trust?
Teachers, like the original and ultimate influencers, right? And it is an interesting point, because I think people do trust, and we saw this in the data. People trust the folks who are in their orbit, right, in their local community, who they can see. And so, I don't know what the answer is to trying to steer people towards that. But I think, the proximity that you have to people also really kind of engenders that trust. It's why people trust their employer, right? It's who's in their community, it's who they feel like is in their community, and who they're close to, right? And so I always find it interesting that how much sway online influencers do hold because it is such an impersonal business. And when you think about who really is trusted, it is the people who are personal, the neighbors, the teachers, the people I work with, my coworkers, my boss, my CEO, the people that you know, those are the people who I really show up. I think in data like this as being trusted. So I think it is about really like focusing on who is that community that you can be a part of, that is close to you and that you have proximity.
Briar, did you have anything to say? I'm sorry,
I'll,
Ben.
I'll let Ben, I'll let Ben chime in, and then I have one more thing to add.
Okay, great.
Just a personal aside, and when Laura was speaking, it made me think of my mother, who was a librarian.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the 2026 version of library is. I know they still exist, but that became such a
Yeah.
like community and trust. And so when you talk about education, and my grandparents were in education, and I had a stint in higher ed, there's something valuable to hold on to there.
I was just going to say, I know the question was around healthcare, at least in this context, but from a financial perspective, and I guess really any topic, I think the data shows people are increasingly, if not the majority now, are using AI, right, to search for literally anything. And so if we know that, and we know SEO sort of as a legacy tactic is kind of dead, and GEO is where everyone's focused, I think that does benefit companies to make sure that their content is out there as much as possible because they're getting more eyeballs on it. And so if we imagine for a second that our content is in fact the most accurate and credible, then that actually is to our advantage. So I think using that trend to fill the vacuum with as much credible content is right. And so companies that aren't creating as much content as at least traditionally should absolutely be thinking about doing it more to combat what I think is we're seeing in the chat.
And ensuring accuracy of representations online, because that also can pull through in LLMs as well. So just making sure that things are inaccurate or flagged immediately and changed.
And I guess just one final note, I know we're at the end, but I also think it's interesting to think about this in the context of where we are in the arc of how much this technology will shift the way we consume information. I think there's already such a feeling of just everybody being inundated with the sheer amount of content and trying to understand where it comes from, how you can trust it. And I think something we see at Semaphore, but also that I see as myself as a news consumer, is just how much there's interest in understanding, like, is this being done by a human? Who wrote it? Like, where did this come from? And Semaphore, as an organization, really catered to delivering intelligence to global decision makers and business leaders. And for those audiences, they want to know, like, they don't take at face value a recommendation or a takeaway. They want to understand where it came from. And I think that will shift us increasingly to being more towards these kind of in-person convenings and towards really identifying like a human-led insights and human-led intelligence as we're getting inundated with kind of the artificial intelligence as well.
I always say media literacy should be taught in middle school, and now it's at a whole other level. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you to our panelists. Thanks, Margot, for going through the report. Thank you to IPR. Thank you to our attendees. You guys had wonderful questions. I wish we could have gotten to them all. I wish everybody a great afternoon and continue the conversation elsewhere.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you guys. Nice to see you.